colleagues, and our guests. Welcome to this public lecture hosted by the Discipline of Public Governance within the School of Governance. My name is Siana Tuli. I'm the academic leader of the Discipline of Public Governance, acting within the School of Management and Governance, within the Center for Law and Management Studies. And I will be the director proceedings today. Ladies and gentlemen, students, let us welcome Professor Mupangizi to give us a welcome address. While she makes her way, I feel that it's appropriate for me to give a brief background of Prof. Mupangizi. Prof. Mupangizi is an NRF-rated researcher, NRF Sachi Chair for Sustainable Local Rural Livelihoods. She's previously served as the Dean and Head of School of the School of Management, IT and Governance, and also prior to that was Dean for Teaching and Learning in the College of Law and Management Studies. She has served as interim Dean of the School of Built Environment and Development Studies at Humanities. Yes, welcome, Prof. Mupangizi.
Esteemed colleagues, distinguished guests, I guess I have to start again. Esteemed colleagues, distinguished guests, our respected students, ladies and gentlemen, those present here and those joining us online, good afternoon. I greet you all on behalf of our Dean and Head of School, Professor Mutula, who couldn't be with us here today. But I also greet you on behalf of my Chair of Sustainable Rural Livelihoods. And I also greet you on behalf of the academics in the School of Management, IT, and Governance. Ladies and gentlemen, today is a day of many firsts. Firstly, it is not every day that we host an ambassador at large. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it is not every day that we have the privilege of welcoming home one of our own. And I've just learned that it's actually not one of our own, it's actually two of our own, because Madam Ambassador also walked the corridors of the then University of Durban-Westville, now the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Sukler has dual expertise, and his dual expertise will assist us as we endeavor to position the University of KwaZulu-Natal as an international research incentive beacon, casting light on the myriad of challenges that our country and our continent face and the problems that humanity at large faces. And it is no minor feat to hold both the hats of an academic and a diplomat. And so we commend the ambassador for doing so with such great aplomb. Colleagues, at the nexus of academic rigor and practical application lies the role of institutions, particularly research institutions such as ours. Specifically within our School of Management, IT and Governance, the College of Law and Management Studies, and within the constituent disciplines within the college, we are not just facilitators of knowledge. We are also the vanguard for the university's strategic vision. So for our school, indeed for our college, public lectures, much like the one we have the privilege to participate in today, are not merely about disseminating knowledge. They are indeed indicative of our broader commitment to civic and community engagement, a testament to our dedication to embedding teaching, research, and scholarship within the contours of real-world challenges and real-world needs. The commitment of our school, of our college, and of the disciplines, and particularly the discipline of public governance, to which I proudly belong, is not an isolated endeavor. It is meticulously aligned with the UKZN Strategic Plan 2023 to 2032. The plan, in its visionary articulation, envisions the university not as an insular institution, but as a responsive and proactive entity, fostering meaningful and mutual dialogues with stakeholders on local, provincial, national, and global scale. Ladies and gentlemen, in the recently convened gathering of the Brics education ministers here in South Africa not too long ago, our Minister for Higher Education, Dr. Blade Nzimande, underscored a very essential truth. He highlighted the centrality of academics within Brics paradigm, calling them to delve deeper into pertinent topics, such as the potential Brics currency or the nuanced role of the envisaged new development bank. The minister's call, colleagues, is a testament to the weight and responsibility that rests upon academics' shoulders. The minister's call is a clarion call underscoring that the research community within Brics is not just a passive observer, but a proactive elucidator tasked with rendering clarity of very complex geopolitical, social, and economic tapestries. Today's discourse on regional and global trends, past, today, and future, a governance perspective that the ambassador is about to delve into, it's more than just timely. It is also exigent. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves at a cardinal nexus. On the one hand, we have technological advancements and innovations pushing the very frontiers of what's conceivable. On the other hand, we grapple with stark dichotomies of affluence juxtaposed against grinding poverty and chronic indigence, with the promises of a brighter future clouded by the immediate threats of climate change and pandemics. This dichotomy, ladies and gentlemen, begs for novel governance perspectives. For, as history and wisdom tell us, the solutions of yesterday are ill-equipped to address the quandaries of today, the dilemmas of our time. We hope and look towards summits like the recently concluded Brics Summit. By fostering international collaborations and sharing expertise, mobilizing resources, these summits promise coordinated action. They also promise the pooling of knowledge and the leveraging of collective strength. Thereby, such summits offer us hope for tangible solutions and a unified path in the face of these multifaceted challenges of our times. Considering the recent conclusion of the Brics Summit, the insights we anticipate today are not just current or contemporary, but they are also in many ways visionary, because they provide a contemporary analysis on the intricate dynamics that shape Brics nations and their roles on the global stage. For my fellow academics and our ever-curious students, I see very many of you here, our role is pivotal. We must approach these discussions and such lectures with critical inquiry, equipped with ethical research methodologies, aiming to contribute substantively to the discourse of governance within the Brics fraternity and beyond. Ambassador Sukalal, it's not just your esteemed position that we honor today, but also the fact that you and your dear wife walked the very halls of UKZN. Your journey from our lecture rooms to the global stage embodies the promise and the potential that resides with each UKZN student. And as we listen keenly to your insights today, we pledge to further the discourse, ensuring that the seeds of ideas sown today find fertile ground in research and that they resonate within the broader academic community. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Ambassador Sukalal and his beloved wife seated here with a huge round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, I see fit that I briefly provide a background in addition to what we've received from Prof. Mangizi. Even though Prof. Sukalal, our guest today, has extensive list of achievements, but also allow me to simply give you a quick summary of his professional profile. Ambassador Prof. Anil Sukalal occupies the role of Ambassador of at-large Asia and Brics at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa. He is also South Africa's Sherpa to Brics. He's the Brics Sherpa and also the IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, and also the Aurora Sherpa, which is Indian Ocean Rim Association Corporation. He is a holder of 2 doctorates from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Prof. Mangizi had mentioned earlier on that before joining academia, before joining government, he was in academia, and in 1995, he not only worked at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, but he also worked for other universities, for another university, which is University of South Africa, UNISA. He holds, further to that, many fellowships and honors. I'll just mention a few. He held a fellowship in human rights at the United Nations in Geneva in 1993, adjunct professor of Fujian Agriculture and Forestry University in China since 2016, senior adjunct fellow research and information systems for developing countries in New Delhi, India, 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students, let us give a warm welcome to Ambassador Prof. Anil Sukalal, a treasure trove of information on today's theme. Thank you.
Can I take my jacket off? I recall lecturing here, we didn't need to wear jackets. But I recall in the very early days, students had to wear a tie and jacket to come to university. Thank you, Dr. Ntuli, Professor Mubangizi. Thank you. Firstly, thank you for inviting me back home. Being here is very nostalgic in many ways. I recall sitting in this very Senate chamber through some very difficult conversations in very difficult circumstances, but that's behind us now. And this university had a major role in shaping my formative career, not only as an academic, first being a student here, and subsequently spending 10 years lecturing here before I joined government at the beginning of 1995. All of that would not have been possible if I didn't get the grounding I received in this institution, which I hold very dear to my heart, for shaping me and forming my views of life, not only as a student involved in our struggle, but subsequently working as a diplomat for a democratic South Africa. So it all begins from this very institution. I'm deeply privileged to be here today to share some thoughts with you on the Brics Summit that we have recently concluded. Now, of course, you are interested specifically looking at it from a governance perspective, given that you are from the School of Governance and Law. But everything comes from the issue of governance. And I think before I can start analyzing and giving you some perspectives on the Brics Summit, it's important you understand the context in which the summit took place. A number of articles have been written post the summit, which I think is a welcome view that we can get different perspectives, not just from our South African journalists, academic think tanks. I was just looking at the outcome of a roundtable held in one of our sister universities, analyzing the outcome of the summit, and one of our think tanks based here in KZN. This past weekend, I was reading an article written by one of the think tanks based on the summit. And therefore, I'm extremely privileged that you have invited me here so that I could share with you the insights of the summit, and you could also clarify issues pertaining to the summit, not just the success of the summit, but perhaps maybe some of you feel that we could have done more than what we have achieved, and this is what some of these articles pertain to. But I think as academics and as researchers and as students, it's very it's very important that when you put pen to paper, you have the correct information at hand, especially if you're putting it out into the public domain. Now, one of the articles written that I read this past weekend indicated that Brics, indeed, the summit delivered on 4 of the 5 key areas that we identified as South Africa, as the government and the host, and it didn't deliver on one key issue. I will come back to that key issue, but the issue that South Africa did not deliver on at the summit was on de-dollarization. Now, I found this strange because a month ago, I gave a lecture at the Howard College in terms of our priorities and preparation for the summit, and like I did at many universities throughout the country in preparation for the summit. And also about a month ago, we had a briefing to the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, in Johannesburg, and this question of de-dollarization came up. And I said this, as I repeatedly said, there is no agenda item for the 15 Brics Summit called de-dollarization. So when an academic writes that we have not fulfilled on this agenda item, how can we fulfill it if it was not on the agenda? A summit or a meeting speaks to what's on the agenda. Unless something is brought onto the table under any other business at the last moment. But that did not occur. And that was the first misconception, which I will speak to later. The second, based on the roundtable, and these are academics and think tanks that I work with and know very well, the assumption made there is that South Africa has no Brics strategy. And the question, what is South Africa's Brics strategy? Now, I've been very fortunate that I've been part of South Africa's Brics team since 2012, serving first as sous Sherpa when we chaired in 2013 and subsequently as Sherpa since 2016. And I have been one of the chief architects in drawing up our Brics strategy, which went to Cabinet and was approved by Cabinet. So I know that we have a Brics strategy. How is it that we could have hosted 3 summits in 2013, 2018, and now 2023 without us as a government, and not just as government, because Brics is not just about government. It is about all of South Africa. How can we do this without having a strategy in place? It means that we are going into this blind, and that is not true. And I find it very unfortunate that these kind of assumptions are made when all it would have taken is a phone call to say, do you have a Brics strategy? Not only do we have a Brics strategy, I recall in 2012, as we were preparing to go to host the summit for the first time, we had to draft a strategy. And that was an all of government and all of society process. We had consultations and workshop intergovernmentally, and we did so with the private sector as well as civil society. Based on that, we drafted a strategy that went to Cabinet and was approved at the end of 2012 as the guiding document that will guide us in us chairing in 2013. Of course, we revise this on a regular basis because Brics summits are held every year. You don't have a strategy in place just when you are in the chair. So every year we revise the strategy based on the changing global environment, and many of you here are involved in the international relations space. And you know that's not a static space, it's a dynamic space. It changes by the hour, by the day. So we revise that annually and go back to Cabinet. We did that in 2018. We conducted an inclusive exercise and went to Cabinet at the end of 2017, and our strategy was approved for our chairship in 2018. Now, as we prepared for 2023, we started our process quite early because we don't reinvent the wheel. We have done this twice already, and we build on drawing on our past knowledge base, strengthening that and improving that. So when we went into the process for 2018, we started this consultation in October 2021. I had a conversation with Minister Pandor to understand what her perspectives are and what her expectations are. Having discussions with President Ramaphosa, she guided me and said, this is what we should be looking at as we assume the chairship. When we conducted workshops at every level from October 2021 to February 2022, we had several workshops in different provinces, including this province. We partnered with think tanks, with universities. We had discussions with our business councils and civil society. And in March, we went to Cabinet with a document called South Africa's Roadmap to chairing of Brics in 2023. And that was approved, and I recall President Ramaphosa commending our department for being so proactive and coming to Cabinet so early. We then conducted further consultations as part of the process to identify what our priorities would be as South Africa during our chairship, what would be our key deliverables, and what would be our themes. And this, again, came from that collective process. And we sifted that all into 5 key priorities, 5 deliverables, and 3 possible themes, which we then sent back to Cabinet in July of last year. And Cabinet then decided on one of those themes and endorsed our priorities that we had recommended and our deliverables. Now, Of course, that shows you that this is a very deep process that we embark upon, that we take our chairship very seriously, because it is about South Africa on the global stage. And it can't be that we go into this process without having a proper strategy and without having a collective of government, civil society, business, academia, our think tanks, all being part of this process. I thought I would give you that background to misallay some of the misconceptions that's out there in terms of how we conduct foreign relations. Our foreign relations is being firmly planted on our foreign policy based on our constitution as it evolved in 1994. The foreign policy that President Mandela put in place is still there. It's unchanged. Of course, we tweak it in terms of the needs of the day as the foreign policy space constantly evolves. But there are five pillars that govern South Africa's foreign policy. Firstly, as you know, during the apartheid period, we were not of Africa. Apartheid South Africa divorced itself from this continent. So firstly, we reinserted ourselves as an African country in an African continent and emphasized our Pan-Africanism. So the first pillar of our foreign policy is about advancing the African agenda through the AU Agenda 2063. And that also involves advancing our regional agenda, specifically in our case, SADC. So that's the first pillar, advancing the African agenda. The second pillar of our foreign policy is recognizing that we are a country of the South. Apartheid South Africa believed that they were a country of the North. But we are a country of the South, we immersed in the South, and that is why we participated in the first meeting of the Global South that took place in 1955 in Bandung in Indonesia, the first Asia-Africa Summit. We partook there as the ANC, not as the South African government. Two representatives from the current governing party, which then was still banned, as you're all familiar with, went to that conference to champion the newly independent sovereign countries of Asia and Africa that got together to see how they could work together to charter a part of development for the global South coming out of imperialism and colonialism. Moses Kotane and Molvi Kachalia were tasked to go and represent the ANC and to meet with the key delegations there from China, Vietnam, India, others that were there to champion our cause. So we are rooted in the South. So that is the second pillar. How do we strengthen South-South cooperation? Thirdly, of course, we are part of this global community. We are part of this global community. We are not anti-North, we are not anti-West. They are our partners, and we need to work in tandem with all of our partners. So how do we strengthen North-South collaboration and interaction? That's a very key pillar of our foreign policy. And of course, a very fundamental part of our foreign policy is strengthening the multilateral global architecture. We function not only within a bilateral framework, but we also function in a world governed by the multilateral architecture, be it your United Nations system, your financial institutions, your trade institutions, and your other subsidiary bodies of the United Nations. So reforming and strengthening multilateralism is a key pillar, including upholding the values of human rights and fundamental freedoms, especially given our own painful history pertaining to these issues. So these are the five key pillars: advancing the African agenda, advancing regional integration, advancing South-South cooperation, strengthening North-South interaction, and advancing the multilateral and reforming the multilateral global order. Now that are the five key pillars that informs our foreign policy. That's not changed from 1994 to the present time. That is static. But how do we conduct ourselves on each of these pillars? That changes based on the nuances of the day. And this is what informs South Africa's Brics strategy. Brics is firstly about advancing our national interest. It must be of benefit to you and I. Us being part of BRICS, what value does it bring to the ordinary South African that is struggling with poverty, that is struggling with unemployment and underdevelopment? What value does BRICS membership or any of our membership in regional and global bodies bring to the lives of our people? It must address that. That is why we say, firstly, BRICS must speak to our national interest. How does it advance our national interest based on our domestic priorities? Secondly, it's about advancing the collective. How do we collaborate between the five of us, drawing on each other's strengths and making sure that this partnership benefits us, be it from the geopolitical perspective, be it from the financial perspective, be it from the economic perspective, the technological perspective, the human resource perspective, building capacity, getting training and scholarships for our people. So it's also about that dimension. And thirdly, how do we ensure that as a collective, we impact in changing this uneven global order that we find that we live in today? What can we do as a collective? Because collectively, as the five of us, we're far more powerful than each one of us individually trying to champion for change in a world where the global hegemons, don't want change. So how can we do it collectively? And of course, as I said, an integral part of our foreign policy is whenever we are in bilateral or multilateral meetings, it's about our national interests firstly, but secondly, it's also about advancing the African agenda. That's embedded. That's embedded in all of our interaction. What is in it for South Africa? What is in it for Africa? They are two sides of the same coin in whatever we do. And that's what we do within BRICS as well. And therefore, when we were planning the first summit that we hosted in 2013 in this very city, Cabinet was very clear that this is the first time a BRICS summit is coming to South Africa. It can't be just about South Africa. It has to be about the African continent as well. What is it that BRICS can do to also assist in Africa's development trajectory? And that's why that first summit was the first time we, South Africa, introduced the idea of an outreach, that BRICS can speak to itself. The five leaders get together, have a summit, take decisions about how we move together on various issues. But we said that it must be more than that. It must also address Africa's development. What can the BRICS collective do to advance Africa's upliftment? So from there, we introduced the idea of outreach, and it's become mandatory now. Every BRICS summit thereafter, you had an outreach. BRICS leaders met, followed by an outreach with leaders firstly from within the region. That is what we introduced in 2013. But in 2017, China brought an additional layer. China said, let's not just meet with leaders from the region. We are about the global south. Let's also invite leaders from the global south so that we have a larger meeting from within the region and the global south. So that's why we have the equation. BRICS summit together with the region and what we call BRICS Plus, referring to the larger global south. So this is what we did in 2013 for the first time, and we brought Africa on board. Now many, of course, ask the question, does South Africa have a mandate to speak on behalf of Africa? Of course we don't have a mandate, nor should we try to represent Africa. We are a sovereign independent country amongst the 55 AU states. But it is within our domain to speak about Africa and advance Africa's interest. But yes, as far as BRICS is concerned, when we were going to the summit in 2012 in New Delhi, then President Zuma received a letter that was signed by 3 leaders who represented the AU collective at that stage. It was President Boni Yaya, who was chair of the African Union in 2012. It was the late President Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, who was chairing NEPAD, the heads of state and government coordinating committee of NEPAD, and Jan Ping, who was the AU Commission chair. All 3 of them signed one letter to President Zuma saying, when you go to the summit in New Delhi, make sure that you champion Africa's development within Brics. So that's been there. And ever since, whenever we participate in Brics, we also report to the AU summit in terms of what is happening vis-a-vis Brics and the AU. So in a sense, yes, we do have a mandate as far as advancing Africa within Brics. So in 2018, while we were chairing Brics, we were also chairing SADC at the same time. So President Ramaphosa took a decision that we'll invite the entire SADC leadership to come as part of the outreach with Brics, and we also invited the Global South. We had a formula in inviting the Global South. We invited the political heads of all the major Global South bodies like your NAM, your G77, your CARICOM, your Pacific Island States, your Gulf Cooperation Council, Organization of Islamic Conference, all your major Global South bodies, heads were invited. We had 22 heads of state in Johannesburg at the summit in 2018, the 10 Brics Summit, and a very vibrant interaction with good outcomes. Now, when we prepared for 2018, the directive was very clear. We must continue with the partnership between Africa and Brics as part of our theme. And that is why Cabinet approved the theme, Brics and Africa, Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism. Now, we'll come and unpack that in a short while to see how we fared in terms of the summit. Furthermore, in terms of our Africa focus, it was agreed that we'll use the summit to advance the African Continental Free Trade Agreement with our Brics partners to see how they can partner with us in ensuring the successful implementation and the role that they can play for mutual benefit in taking the AFCTA forward. So that was a major focus for us. Now, of course, what became very important for this summit, and I must say that when we were assuming the chair, many in the department felt that we were taking up the chairship at a very difficult moment in terms of what was happening on the global geopolitical front. You had come out of the impact of COVID, the devastating impact of COVID. And when I speak of the devastating impact of COVID, I'm not only speaking of the loss of human life and the challenges around access to vaccine, especially for African and countries of the Global South, but I'm also speaking about what came to be termed as vaccine apartheid or vaccine nationalism that polarized the world even more so. We had the opportunity during the pandemic to come together as a global community, irrespective whether we were from the north or south, from Asia, Africa, Middle East, North America or Australasia. It didn't matter. We had a common enemy that struck everyone, inclusively. But how did we behave as a human community in terms of protecting lives? Some lives were regarded as more important, those that had access to vaccines and had the technology and the manufacturing capacity. And that wasn't the Global South, and that wasn't Africa. So what that did was to polarize and divide the world even further. Now, on the back of that, of course, you have major other challenges, but you then had the Russia-Ukraine conflict that came onto the table, and this polarized the world even more. But even before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, you had major fault lines between major powers and emerging powers, especially the tensions between the USA and China, the sanctions that the USA placed on China, especially on technology, and the growing rift and unease between a rising China and the one superpower that you have currently. So in addition to that, you have many other challenges that were of great concern to human society as a whole. So you had major power contestation, you had war and conflict, you had the pandemic, you had the issue of climate change, extreme weather, like we just experienced last week in Cape Town, KZN not too long ago. You would have seen floods in New York last week, a first world city devastated, where the infrastructure couldn't cope with the flooding, loss of lives, the damage to property, things that we in the so-called global south in Africa have been used to. But now it's impacting even in the developing world. Issues of biodiversity loss. So you have what Thomas Friedman speaks of the age of accelerations, a number of factors coming simultaneously and confronting the human mind, or as some writers call the polycrisis, the age of the polycrisis. Many feel that we are on the verge of a polycrisis, that we have so many crises confronting humanity. I've alluded to some of them, and that as a human community, we don't know how to deal with these because we don't do so collectively. We do so in a very divided, fractured, polarized global community. So South Africa took over the chairship on 1st of January this year in this very difficult environment. Now, of course, we sent out invitations. President Ramaphosa sent out invitations to all of the Brics leaders, inviting them to the summit in Johannesburg in August. And within about 2 or 3 weeks, we had a major challenge with one of the invitees. The International Criminal Court indicated that President Putin, the Russian president, should he come to South Africa, will have to be arrested because South Africa is party to the Rome Statute. We are a member of the International Criminal Court, and as a responsible member of the global community, we abide by the treaties that we sign. So this placed South Africa in a great deal of difficulty. I'm not sure if this warrant was put out at that time by accident or by design, but it created a major challenge for South Africa on how we would deal with the issue of President Putin. We had this challenge in 2016 when we hosted the AU summit and when President Bashir, the former Sudan president who had a warrant of arrest put out on him by the ICC. And that created a major, major challenge for South Africa, his presence here, and where we had to go and make representations at The Hague. Now, of course, the president decided that he would appoint a committee under Deputy President Mashatile, aided by some of our cabinet ministers, to look into the options open to South Africa. But it was not just that. It was also pressure brought to bear on South Africa in terms of the position we took with regard to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, as you know, there was tremendous pressure when this issue went to the United Nations General Assembly in terms of how you should vote in support of the resolution in favor of condemning Russia and supporting the invasion, condemning the invasion and supporting the position of Ukraine. South Africa, as I said, based on our foreign policy, we have an independent, autonomous foreign policy. No matter whatever pressure we came under over these past 30 years, we have not deviated from that and appeased any one side. We didn't do this when you had the invasion of Iraq in 2001 following the 9/11 events, when we were asked that either you are with us or against us, and a list of countries were made that were with the USA and its allies. We didn't take a position on either side then. We observed what we called a non-aligned strategic neutrality position. And that does not mean sitting on the fence. That means firmly sitting on a position you believe in, that you are not going to take sides in this, but you are going to try and find solutions to the crisis. So that has been South Africa's position, despite tremendous pressure placed on South Africa. And you also are fully aware there were these false allegations on Lady R that we were supplying weapons to the Russians to fuel this war even further. And of course, again, I think we did brilliantly where our president appointed a committee under a retired judge. And recently, you were aware these findings, at least the summary of it, was made available to the public at large, the international community at large, that these were nothing but allegations without any grounding, because we could not, despite inviting those that made allegations, give us proof, and we will look into it. But we did look into it. Now, these were some of the challenges that were placed on the pathway to our chairship. There were rumors that South Africa will not host the summit. It will be given to one of the other Brics countries. About 2 weeks before the summit, when we had resolved the issue of President Putin's attendance, that he will attend the summit virtually, and that he will participate fully in all of the sessions where the leaders are participating, that pulled the rug from under the feet of those that tried to collapse the summit in South Africa, because we found a creative solution. And this was done in consultation, because BRICS is a consensus-based organization. It was done in consultation with all role players, not just in discussions with President Putin. President Ramaphosa was there at the end of July for the second Russia-Africa summit. They had detailed discussions. He had discussions several times over, I'm aware of it, with Prime Minister Modi, with President Lula, with President Putin himself. And he made sure that he had discussions with President Xi as well on several occasions. And collectively, the BRICS decided that in the best interest, not to undermine the success of the summit, President Putin then agreed he will attend virtually. So that took care of a major obstacle. Then you had, of course, constantly in the public domain, that this summit is about de-dollarization and that we want to collapse the US dollar. It never was, nor is. But what it was and what was on the agenda, if you looked at the BRICS leaders' agenda, it was about the use of local currency, or as some started calling it, a BRICS currency. That's very different from de-dollarization. Of course, as President Lula said earlier this year when he went on a state visit to China, he asked the question, who decided that the dollar must be the supreme currency, the God currency, so to say? He asked this question. Because if you look at global trade today, at one stage, yes, the USA was the world's largest trading partner, but no longer. China is today. The USA's share and the EU's share of manufacturing has declined. That of the global south has risen. And yet, over 50% of global trade today is still invoiced in the US dollar. And yet, the global trading regime today is a multipolar trading regime. It's no longer a unipolar trading regime in terms of global trade. But you still have this disjuncture. So what BRICS leaders are saying, and this is not something coming from this summit. Several years back, we signed an interbank agreement between our development banks to start trading in local currency. The new development bank last year took a decision, and the president of the bank, former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, who currently heads the bank, addressed the summit as well. And what the leaders said, and they had a very robust discussion because it was on the agenda, how can we deepen the use of local currency? Now, BRICS has started a process. BRICS has been the architect of this process to say that we need to start using local currency. Why must we trade with Nigeria? Why can't we trade in rands and naira? Why must we trade with Botswana in a foreign currency? Why can't we trade between rand and pula? The African Union is asking this question, and as part of advancing the AFCTA, the AU took a decision that we must look at trading in local currency, and that's why the Afro-Exim Bank has set up a platform to trade in local currency, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, where you can now start trading in local currency, and this is envisaged will save Africa at least $5 billion annually in trade costs if we start trading amongst ourselves in local currency. Now, you saw that India has signed agreements with over 20 countries to trade in the rupee and the local currencies. They've created their own payment settlement systems. Russia and China have created their own payment platforms. They're no longer solely dependent on the SWIFT system. I was in Russia in May for a conference, and they told me, don't come with dollars or euros, you'll not be able to use it there. But they've created their own payment platform. So has China. So what we are saying within BRICS is that we need to look at greater currency sovereignty, independence, and choices. That's why the BRICS Bank has taken a decision that at least 30% of new borrowing will be in local currency. So if South Africa now takes a loan from the NDB, we can do so in Rand, especially after they've floated the Rand bond on the South African currency market 2 weeks before the summit. And ours is only the second amongst the 5 BRICS countries. They have floated several bonds in the Chinese financial markets, in the Chinese yuan, highly successful. They had set a ceiling to raise 1 billion rands on the South African market. The demand was so high, they raised that ceiling to 1.5. So it means South Africa can also now borrow in the local currency, and that's a major, major boost for local borrowing. So if you look at the Johannesburg II Declaration, Article 45 of the declaration clearly states there that we task our finance ministers and or Reserve Bank governors to look at the use of local currency and payment instruments and platform and report to us at the next summit in Russia next year. So this was discussed thoroughly by the leaders. They have now thrown the ball into the court of finance ministers, Reserve Bank governors, to look into this question of local currency, or what some are calling BRICS currency, and how that can be advanced even further from what is already happening. And this is not just restricted to BRICS countries, as I've said. It's become Africa-wide. A large number of countries from the global south are trading in the local currencies today, and that is working to their benefit. Now, of course, the other major issue in this summit was expansion. Perhaps this became the major focus. The global media focused more on expansion than anything else around this, and the currency on the summit. Now, of course, South Africa was the first recipient of expansion, because when BRICS first met at summit level in 2009 in Russia, we were not part of the BRICS family, nor were we there in 2010 when they met for the second summit in Brazil. Now, of course, there was a realization on both sides from within the 4 BRICS members that if you are creating a bloc of the global south to champion the interest of the global south, you can't omit Africa, an African presence there. So they were keen to have an African country, and we ourselves started lobbying. In 2010, we took a decision that South Africa should be part of that BRICS bloc, because we can see that this is a configuration that can advance our own interests and the interest of the African continent and the global south. So we started intense lobbying, and at the end of 2010, President Hu Jintao, the former president of China, phoned President Zuma and said, we are inviting you to attend the 3rd summit that was going to be held in Sanya in March 2011. So in March 2011, we were fully incorporated as a full member of BRICS. So we were the first phase of expansion in BRICS. From the 4, it became 5. Now, of course, over the years, there have been constantly knocks on the door, countries wanting to join BRICS. And during our chairship, in preparations for our chairship in 2018, we provided a concept paper on expansion, which we put on the table as part of our chairship to look at the question of expansion, given that there were constant knocks on the door. We had several discussions at the level of Sherpas, and recommendations went to the foreign ministers, but the leaders decided in 2018 that BRICS, we first needed to consolidate even further, the 5 of us, the partnership, before we start looking at expansion. Last year, when China hosted the summit virtually, in June of last year, the leaders decided to open up this question of expansion, and Article 79 of the Beijing Declaration specifically spoke to expansion, where they said we need to start discussion on expansion, and we need to start working out guiding principles, standard criteria, and procedure for expansion through the Sherpa Channel. So that was the decision taken by the leaders that we must start looking at the question of expansion. Perhaps because of this, that it was now put into a public domain that Brics is looking at expansion. But I would say it was not just that decision, it was also the global environment of the time, of what is happening on the global stage at the current time. The global environment has changed dramatically, and the Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the UN said this during the Brics Plus and Outreach Summit that took place on the 24th of August in Johannesburg. He said, the world that I live in today, 2023, is not the world of 1945. It's vastly different. The world has changed dramatically. The global architecture, and you're talking of global governance, the global governance architecture that was put in place in 1945 following the end of the Second World War is vastly different from the global architecture of today. That's the reality. The world of 1945, the major part of Africa was still under colonial rule. Over 80% of Africa was still under colonial rule when the United Nations system was put in place. Of course, South Africa was there as a founding member of the UN, but it was apartheid South Africa that was there, not our South Africa. The major part of Asia and Latin America was under colonial rule. China was not yet in power. They were fighting a civil war between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party to see who gains ascendancy as who will rule China going into the future. India was still under colonial rule in 1945, and so were the major parts of Africa and Asia. So that architecture was put in place by the so-called liberal West countries and put in place to take care of the reconstruction and bringing a governance system that will speak to their needs. Because you must remember, the last century was a century of bloodshed, of war, of exploitation, of imperialism, of colonialism, brought onto the world not by us, but the hegemons of that period. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, 9 million Europeans died. 9 million Europeans died. It was a war in Europe. Some 13 million civilians perished in that war. And so a few years later, 1939 to 1945, the so-called Second World War, 50 million citizens died, over half of them civilians. A war not of our making. So they put in place an architecture, the United Nations system, a charter that clearly outlined the purposes and principles of what the UN is about and its subsidiary bodies. They put in place the financial architecture, your Bretton Woods system, your IMF and World Bank. It was originally called the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, because that bank was put in place for the redevelopment of Europe, because Europe was devastated. That is why the USA designed the Marshall Plan to uplift and assist Europe in its reconstruction and development. What plan did we get from any part of the world? Of course, those allies that supported the anti-apartheid movement did support us. But was there a specific plan to uplift South Africa and the devastation that colonialism and apartheid brought onto our country, or any of the African countries devastated by slavery, imperialism, colonialism, or any of the Asian countries or your Latin American countries? Was there a Marshall Plan for them? Like you had a vaccine nationalism and apartheid, you had very much same in terms of lifting the rest of the world. It was about them and not about us. And this is what, of course, the global South was not in a position to challenge the hegemony of the liberal West. Because all of us were trying to build our countries as new sovereign independent states. Much later we had to get that, much later. And where were the resources coming from? Because we were left devastated. The two largest global economies prior to 1810, prior to the Industrial Revolution, over 60% of your global economy was controlled by India and China. That was your two largest global economy. By the time the British left India, India didn't account for 2% of the global economy. And yet at one stage over 30% of the global economy. The same with China. When the G7 was formed in 1975, the US economy was $1.6 trillion. China's economy was just about 10% of that, $160 billion. And how has the world changed in terms of Antonio Guterres' words? The world of 1945 and the world of 2023. US economy is $26 trillion today, China is 19. About 7 or 8% difference between the two. Just in 1975 it was 90% the difference. And now you can understand the contestation and you can contextualize Brics. China is the second largest global economy. Earlier this year, India overtook its colonial master, the UK, to become the fifth largest global economy. Russia and Brazil ranks in the top 10 global economies. So you are speaking of a vastly changed world where the global south is rising and continue to rise. And one of the challenges that also exacerbated and made our chairship more complex was the figures that were released in terms of PPP GDP in June this year. For the first time, Brics overtook the G7. In terms of PPP GDP, Brics account for 31.7% and the G7 accounts for 30%. So here you have the global souths bigger than the traditional major players in terms of the global economy. And Jim O'Neill, who takes a lot of credit, he coined the term BRIC. He didn't coin the term BRICS. He coined the term BRIC. So it's not one and the same because that S is a big S with South Africa there. He predicts that by 2030, in terms of PPP, BRICS will account for 50%. This was before the expansion took place. So expansion took on a life of its own. As Sherpas, we were quite involved in developing the guiding principles, standard criteria, and procedure for expansion. But what we saw is a rush of countries. Formally, 22 countries approached BRICS partners saying they want to become full members of BRICS, and informally about 20 plus countries also. And this, of course, created a great deal of anxiety, especially from our partners in the global north. What is happening suddenly within BRICS? And there were a lot of speculation. Will BRICS really expand? And how is it going to expand? And who would become members of BRICS? Of course, we took this exercise very seriously, and we conducted several workshops with civil society, with think tanks and our business councils, getting views on how South Africa should respond to expansion. But what became very clear, I must say from the very outset, South Africa was pro-expansion. As I said, already in 2018 we put this on the table. Now expansion is natural in any organization. G7, which became G8 when Russia joined and then went back to G7 when Russia was kicked out in 2014 after the incursion into Crimea. The ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, started off with 5 countries in 1967. Today they are 10. The European Union started off in 1957 with 6 members. Today they're 27. It went to 28, dropped back to 27 with the UK exiting. So expansion is normal in any organization, and I think it was important that BRICS also deal with the question of expansion given that a large number of countries, and the question is why? Why this sudden interest from major countries of the global south wanting to be full members? Obviously, we were doing something right. What were we doing right? Let me leave aside the cooperation between ourselves and how that continued to strengthen. This year, we will host close to 200 meetings as part of our chairship. We have 19 ministerial tracks. We have expert level groups meeting. We have meetings of senior officials. We have the meeting of the business councils, the academia, the Brics Academic Forum, the Brics Think Tank Council that met earlier this year. All very vibrant cooperation and continues to expand. Now, of course, there are certain values and principles that Brics espouses to. It's not a homogeneous grouping. We have major differences. We have different systems of governance, socialism, communism, democracies, all working together. But the strength of Brics, and that's the point I constantly make, human society is not a homogeneous society. The beauty of human society is the differences that each one of us bring to the table. Our vast and varied cultures, civilizations, histories, languages, cuisine, modes of dressing, whatever you have. This is the richness, the fabric that makes human society what it is today. The strength of the fabric of human society would Madiba categorize as the rainbow nation, looking at our own society. And that's why I say today, when speaking at one of the conferences, I say we have a rainbow Brics. That's the strength of Brics. Each one of the 5 countries bring its own strengths and value systems and diversity that creates this Brics. We don't want to create a homogeneous entity. There is no such thing. Nor the G7, nor the EU, or any other body is homogeneous. So our points of differences is far outweighs by our points of inflection, where we come together on areas where we agree. And that's why the issue of the summit of inclusive multilateralism, how do we change this global multilateral architecture, this governance architecture that does not speak to our needs today, that speaks to the needs of a few, and that few want to still cling onto that. There's a very good book you must read if you're a student of political science, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics by John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer points out that the last century was a bloody century, but at least at the turn of this century and the beginning of the millennium, we had basically a peaceful global environment, no major wars, major conflicts. But he pointed out, and this book was written some 20 plus years ago, at the dawn of the millennium, that this peace is a false peace because human history has been a history of conflict and contestation. And how true that is today. Far more today we have major power contestation, conflicts, and the various other challenges that I've mentioned to you. But he points out that the major powers will not want to give up territory. They will want to preserve the domain of power, and the greatest insurance in doing that is to amass more power and ensure those that are rising are contained. And that's what we see happening. The US containment of China through various means. But that containment policy cannot work. It has never worked in history. You can't prevent the global south from rising. I mean, if you looked at the UN, we became an 8 billion population in the world. Late last year, I think it was. The prediction is that at the turn of this century, population will peak just under 10 billion or so. 89% of that population will be Asia and Africa. 89% of the global population. So it means if the world had 10 people, 9 will be either from Asia or Africa. That's the reality of the world. Africa will 1.4 billion. By 2030 will be 1.75 billion. By 2050 will be 2.5 billion. That's an asset, but it also can be a liability in terms of what we do with it. And that's why we say Brics is currently 30% of the global land surface. We are 42% of the global population. As I've said, in PPP terms, we are about 31-32% of global GDP. We are 20% of global manufacturing. But with the +6, BRICS will account for 46% of the global population, almost half, just 11 of us. Will account for 36% of the global landmass. Will account for 25% of global manufacturing. Will account for almost 36% of global GDP. And will account for almost 40% of global foreign reserves. Now, this is a power block, whether we like it or not. And that is why it creates unease amongst countries that says this BRICS cannot work. The latest one now is, you're adding 6 new countries, they're so diverse, it's not going to work. The 11 of you all will never see eye to eye. You've got major conflict on the Grand Renaissance Dam, conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia. You have tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, India and China, just to give you examples. Right? They were making a big thing about tensions between India and China. But all of us recognize, yes, we have differences, we have bilateral issues, but we bracket that. We bracket that and we work for the collective good of all of us and the collective good of the larger global society. And not just the global south. As I said, BRICS is not anti-West. We will work with any partner of the global north. You would have seen that even post-summit, our president was in New York for the General Assembly week before last, and you saw he had many bilateral meetings. And I can tell you, in several of those, they are asking to become members of BRICS, including Turkey, who met with our president now. Turkey wants to become a member of BRICS. So does Greece, a European country, asking to become a member of BRICS. So this membership expansion is not the end. That's why President Ramaphosa, when he announced it, he said this is the first phase of expansion. We took 6 out of the 22. And if you look at Article 92 of Johannesburg II Declaration, the leaders have tasked the foreign ministers to look at the question of partnership, the modalities of partnership, and a list of partner countries, and to report at the summit next year in Russia on the issue of partner countries. So it's ongoing work, because BRICS stands for the very fabric of what we'd like to see, a more inclusive world. Now, many terms have been used in terms of, you must tell me when to stop. You see, as a lecturer, you talk too much, and I haven't lost that trait. Maybe 3 minutes. I'm not even going to look at my PowerPoint. You can share it with the colleagues. I think it's important to understand some of the key outcomes. As I've said, one of the things we did, we fast-tracked the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We've created the Women's Business Alliance, which is the platform that was launched in 2020. They met for the first time now. Because of COVID, they could not meet. The Women's Business Alliance Africa business platform. We had that conference here, the summit here, on the 18th and 19th of August in the ICC in Durban. Over 700 businesswomen from South Africa, and the global south. We had delegates from as far afield as Iran, who see the potential, because Africa is your next frontier of development. They see the potential within our continent. So we have created this platform especially to facilitate business for our small entrepreneurs and women in business. So this platform will be an important platform. We have a very dynamic Women's Business Alliance committee of 5 members, chaired by Ms. Lebogang Zulu, dynamic business person. And they did scoping missions to all of the BRICS countries during the course of this year. And I was speaking to her after the summit, and she told me at the summit they signed deals to the value of 48 billion rands, which can translate into 100,000 plus jobs. So these are the tangibles. Many people ask, what comes out of this BRICS? Our BRICS Business Council, which was launched here in Durban 10 years ago, celebrated 10 years of existence. We have 9 working groups. speaking to all of the major areas, that also speaks to South Africa's development needs from infrastructure, green energy, health, agriculture, new technologies. All of these working groups are there. They signed several MOUs, close to a dozen MOUs, in terms of business deals with the partners from BRICS and non-BRICS countries at the business summit that was held on the 22nd of August. In terms of the BRICS Plus and BRICS Outreach, we invited 64 countries, 61 attended. President Ramaphosa decided that he's going to invite the entire African continent to the summit. And this decision was taken quite late, in June. We were a bit taken aback how we're going to manage this. But I think he was foresighted enough to see that you could not exclude some and invite some, because there were so many African leaders phoning him saying they want to be at the BRICS summit. So he told us, invite the whole continent. And it worked very well. It worked very well. Nearly all of the African countries invited were here, either at the level of heads of state or deputies. Now, in terms of the Global South, we followed the formula of 2013, 2018. We invited all of the Global South bodies, the sitting political chairs like UNAM and so forth. But then there were so many countries writing and saying they want to be at the summit. And we couldn't say no. So whoever wrote and said from the Global South, the head of state wants to come to a summit, we said come. So in the end, we invited 65, 61 of those delegations were here. And if you walked into that room together with the UN head, Guterres, several of our regional banks, African Development Bank, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement Secretariat, all of our key bodies were invited as well. That was almost a meeting of the UN. Last week I was in Washington with our minister. We were meeting with our ambassadors from the Americas. And a number of our ambassadors there came up to me, ambassador to Cuba, to Venezuela, to some of the other Latin American countries. And they said, you know what? South Africa is the flavor of the day in our region. Everyone is coming and patting us on the back for your achievements at the BRICS summit. You have lifted the Global South, and the Global South now is recognized as a force in terms of what happened in Johannesburg. And I think that boosted not just South Africa, but the African continent as a key outcome where the global community now recognizes that this Global South is rising and that you can't ignore it, and that as a collective, when we come together, we will charter what this new architecture is going to be. Many people, you're talking of a multipolar world, a multiplex world, a multi-conceptual world, multi-civilizational world. We live in a gray area. I'm not quite sure exactly what this new architecture will be. But the common word in all of this is multiple. It's not unipolar anymore, bipolar. And the best way I think we can describe the current global governance architecture is that we are living in between orders. We are living in between orders. We're not sure what this new order will look like. But what you can rest assured of is that this new order will be shaped from the Global South, by the Global South, in the forefront. We are no longer going to be bystanders, outliers, observing the rules and regulation. Very often this term rules-based international order is used. The question we constantly raise is whose rules and what order are you talking about? Because the order that we have and the rules that have been put place, we were not party to it. So we speak, yes, we want a reformed, totally reformed multilateral system, underpinned by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and underpinned by international law, not a rules-based international order that we don't know what we are talking about. I've touched briefly on some of the key outcomes, but I'm leaving the PowerPoint presentation. I'm sure Dr. Mtuli will share it with you. But once again, it's such a pleasure coming back. As I said, it's like coming home to be in your midst, and thank you for giving me this privilege to come and share some thoughts with you on the BRICS Summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. It was true, and I was actually on the right mark when I said he is truly a treasure trove of information and knowledge. So thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, now we've come to the Q&A part of this engagement, where we'll be taking a few questions related to today's presentation. Perhaps because of time, we'll limit our questions to 4. Perhaps I can start this side. Anyone? Okay, I've noted you. Okay, I've got 3. I've noted 3. And is there a 4th question? Okay, 4. Okay, I'll start with the far right.
Good day, everyone. So I have a question regarding how is the Brics Summit going to address the great disparity in development and economies of different countries which are members of the Brics, and how is the Brics going to address the political instabilities across the African states, or let's say just states within this Brics Summit? Thank you.
Perhaps, Ambassador, would you like to? Oh, you're going to take all of them. Okay. I've noted you. Is it yes? Your second question?
No, thank you very much. I think in the podium you explained in terms of de-dollarization that it wasn't actually the agenda of the Brics. However, we've seen this thing of a gradual economic development, which sometimes become rhetoric when we look at it. So, in terms of de-dollarization, when we foresee Brics in terms of its existence, we see the globe being created in terms of a multipolar world. So, which must be a decisive decision by the Brics that we cannot be subjected to the dominance of the dollar or the USA, because African countries are being subjected to this dominance of the US dollar. For example, in Zimbabwe, they're suffering from sanctions because of this US. So it's very important that Brics becomes an alternative to the countries which are being sanctioned by the US, including African countries and Latin American countries like Cuba, which has been for many years been sanctioned by the US. Second question is, how is the Brics prioritizing education in terms of looking at the future? Because young people, we believe that are the future of the states that we live in. So education is a very important tool, particularly decolonized education, because we know the history where we're coming from. And right now we are still under the concept what we call neo-colonialism, where we are still colonized economically. So where young people must be educated on how actually to run their own economies moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Okay. The ambassador has requested, perhaps before we move on, just to give your name and where you're coming from or what you are doing. Thank you. We'll start here.
My name is Rihanna.
Luyanda, 3rd year in geology.
My name is Tembo. I'm from here. It's from campus,
Mtembu, Mkondisi, Mtembu, President in waiting. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Amir Nankumar, UKZN alumni. Thank you, Prof, for the very interesting talk. I think it was Dr. Jay Shankar, Foreign Minister of India, who said that the days of the few rule makers are over. see Brics is making that impression on the global stage itself. As you said earlier on, Brics has become a formidable bloc. And yes, there's this burgeoning interest for member countries to come on board as such. The question is, what criteria is in place or is going to be in place to allow interested countries to become a member of BRICS? Thank you, Prof.
Thank you for that. We'll go to our final question.
I'm Andile Jomo. I'm here from UKZN in Australia. So my question is, I'm a small business, IT business. So and I want to touch it. You talked about young for women, focusing on women and small businesses. As it is right now, getting access to funding in South Africa, it's a huge challenge. And you did mention that you have been building up, especially with global and international. But I'm worried about like what's happening in the domestic. How am I as an individual going to get access to even the conference? Because I got access to this conference because I was in KZN, but for another person who didn't go to academic institution, how is he or she going to be able to get access to some information that might change the world or something like that?
I'm a very democratic person. I noted questions until here. Do we have a question from the far left? Just one question from the far left. Yes, I've noted you.
I wanted to ask if there is no amount of certain fear that things might get out of hand if like a lot of getting involved, since like there will be no like minorities who are more powerful, because if more countries get involved, obviously there will need to be some kind of hickory on how to manage Brics. That's what I wanted to ask.
Thank you for that, Prof. She's my student in public policy student. So thank you for that.
No, thank you for those very interesting questions. Luanda, did I get the name right? Yeah. Your question on developing economies of different scales. BRICS is quite diverse. As I indicated to you, China is a giant. But as I've said, BRICS is based on consensus, and decisions we take is by consensus. Now, very often I'm asked what benefit does South Africa derive from this, from an economic point of view, for example. Ours is a small economy of about $420 billion US dollars. China, as I said, $19 trillion US dollars. In 2013, our two-way trade with BRICS, the four BRICS countries, was $340 billion. Last year, it was just around $820 billion. So our trade has more than doubled within a decade. In fact, our trade with BRICS is bigger than our trade with the EU, but there is a difference. Our trade with the EU the balance of trade is in our favor. Our trade with BRICS is in the favor of BRICS countries because we buy more from China, for example, much more. But the challenge is firmly in South Africa's court, because I ask the question, we are 60 million people. India is 1.425 or 43, China 1.42 billion people. These are massive markets with massive middle class, several hundred millions. Why can't we sell into these markets? It's a major consumer market. And the Chinese have asked us, tell us what you want to buy. They come with inward buying missions. So it's an opportunity for us. I'm just using India and China. Brazil is also a massive market. And Brazil could be a template that we could use. Brazil is a country of 216 million people. Brazil's balance of trade with China, China is the largest trading partner, not the USA, the neighbor, almost neighbor. It's China. But 70% of the two-way trade with Brazil is in Brazil's favor, because Brazil is a major global agricultural producer, and China has a voracious appetite for agricultural products. We are starting to do that now with some of our Brics countries. So, yes, you have economies of different scales, but it provides opportunities, more so for us in South Africa and Africa. What we are also saying, and this is also in Johannesburg Declaration, if you look at it, under the economic section, we want beneficiation. We don't want you to come and just take our raw materials. We want you to come and manufacture here. We want technology transfer. It's happening. I can give you numerous examples of Brics country companies that are coming now and looking at manufacturing jointly with us, and also buying directly from us rather than going through a third party. Just yesterday I read an article. This is a direct outcome of the African Union becoming a G20 member now. That Côte d'Ivoire, which is the largest producer of cocoa today, has now said to India that they will sell cocoa directly to India and not through Europe, not through a third party. And that's going to benefit both India and Côte d'Ivoire, because they're also speaking of beneficiation within Côte d'Ivoire. I'm just using these as some examples of the economic benefits. But a lot depends on how we leverage this. Conflict in Africa, if you look at the Johannesburg II Declaration, there's a whole section there. One of the things we do is deal with global conflicts, the so-called global hotspots, including in Africa, and how that we can coordinate in terms of dealing with some of the African crises, especially in West Africa, where we've seen an increasing number of coups, as an example. And what role can Brics play as a positive impact on these conflicts? So there was, and there are constantly discussion in terms of addressing African conflicts through the Brics lens. Mkolisi, multipolar world. Well, if you look at the very first Brics summit outcome, the 2009 summit, as early as 2009, if you go to that declaration, we were not party to that. Brics speak of creating a multipolar world. This was in 2009. Because we are very clear that we don't want a return to a global order where one or two hegemons determine what is in the best interest of all of us. But as I've said, even this word we use, multipolar world, we use it for want of a better term, because we are speaking of different poles of power. But we must ensure that these different poles of power don't start behaving as hegemons as well. We don't want to replace one system with another system that subjects the lesser endowed, the poorer and less developed countries to the same kind of abuse that has taken place. So that's why I say it's still an evolving global order. We're not quite sure how this will evolve, but we are an integral part of that evolution and will shape that order. Of course, if you look at the downfall of colonialism, for the major part of the colonial era, what was the dominant currency? It wasn't the dollar. It was the British pound. The British pound was dethroned by the US dollar through very careful maneuvering when the Bretton Woods institutions were created, and to create that as the current reserve currency. Just last year, you saw a surge, 22% surge in terms of gold holdings, and a drop in terms of dollar holdings, because countries are worried about unilateral sanctions. You've seen it in the case of Russia. You saw it in the case of Iran. You just saw, for the first time, a major prisoner swap between Iran and the USA. They exchanged prisoners. And part of that deal was for the USA to unfreeze $6 billion of Iranian funds that were frozen as a result of unilateral sanctions. So countries saw what has happened in the case of Russia, case of Iran, and how unilateral sanctions can actually deny you access to your funds on the global market because we place our funds in Western controlled institutions. So that is why, and of course the other development that will have a bearing on de-dollarization is the use of cryptocurrencies. Increasingly, many reserve banks now are looking at cryptocurrencies and other forms of new currencies that are coming into the market as a result of new technologies, other forms of settlements as well. So this is something that may happen. It may take 10, 20, or 30 years. We're not sure how long this will take. But the process has started where the global dominance of the dollar is not what it was, nor will it be, going into a future global order from a financial perspective. And as I've said, if you look at Johannesburg II Declaration, we have said that we do not respect unilateral sanctions. South Africa has said this. This is our national position. We do not observe unilateral sanctions. The only body tasked with imposing sanctions is the United Nations Security Council. If they impose sanctions as a full member of the United Nations, we are obliged to observe that. But unilateral sanctions are at the whim and fancy of a certain number of countries. These targeted measures against Zimbabwe, the sanctions against Cuba, against Iran, these are unilateral sanctions. We do not respect that, and the Brics, as a collective, it's said so in the Johannesburg II declarations. We denounce unilateral sanctions. Education, we have the Minister of Education meeting. That's one of the ministerial tracks. Education cooperation is a very important track for us. I think this was a question asked in terms of whether education is a priority and the type of education. Now, you had the education ministers meeting. There are a number of programs, cooperation programs between ourselves, exchange programs between our academics, our universities, our students, and I would suggest you get hold of Department of Higher Education and look at what is happening within this space with regard to education within Brics. Yes, I think Dr. Nankumar, you pointed out criteria. That criteria will be made public shortly. It will be published on the Brics website where we have guiding principles, standard criteria, and procedure for expansion. We are in the process. President Ramaphosa is in the process of formally writing to the 6 leaders and sharing the criteria with them. Once we do that, we'll put that out onto the Brics website and you'll be able to see. Now, for example, one of the things we say as guiding principles is that no country, Brics country, will impose unilateral sanctions against another Brics country. That is one of the guiding principles because we don't believe in unilateral sanctions. On the business front, I would leave with Dr. Ntuli the name and contact details of the chairs of the Brics Business Council and the Women's Business Alliance. Both of them have working groups on ICT. And I think if you get hold of them, then you'll be able to plug into those working groups, will put you into the network of the business community. The last one, fear. I said earlier on, I quoted Mearsheimer, the factor that fuels conflict is the factor of fear of losing power. I don't think Brics is afraid of losing power. We don't have the power. We are trying to say that this power that is controlled by a few must be diffused to be inclusive, to be representative, and to reflect the reality of the global order that exists today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, we are officially closing. But before we close officially, I would like to start by thanking the speaker, of course, and our guests, his family. I'll start with Dr. Nilistra, Dr. Nikita, and I would also like to thank, ladies and gentlemen, all of you for taking your time to come to this public lecture, but also again for the excellent presentation and also thought-provoking engagements. Let us also, which I feel is very important, let's also thank the Dean in his exception. The Dean unfortunately could not attend because of pressing matters, but this day could not have been possible without the support of the Dean. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, we have some refreshments outside. Can you please help yourself?